Smile.
Hello.
Smile.
Hello. And welcome to
We're glad you're here.
Yes. It's Tuesday night. It's 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So
The
best
two
Sal
of
takes
you.
over.
All right. There are people coming in. I see the numbers rising.
One.
It's going to go to the next one.
Exponential. Look at that.
Tell us that you are here. You don't have to tell us where you
We're
are,
here.
but let us know you're here. We'd love for
I
you.
might not be all there, but I am here.
But you are here.
Yes. Nobody wants to do that.
Age old dad joke.
Hello,
Andrea.
Thanks for taking the leap and being the first one to
Yes.
AKA Ma.
Although, is she driving home from book club listening to this? Sometimes that
Don't
worries.
watch. Just listen. Don't watch.
I'm like, you just
You
listen.
just said you don't have to tell us where you are. Just that you're here.
True. All right. Well, there's others. So who else is out there?
Yeah, I'm going to start this thing and you're not going to get shout outs.
I know. Shout outs end as soon as we
That's
start.
it. Oh boy, 9 o'clock. 9:01 is when it ends. That's a hard end.
Hi,
9:01.
April.
There we go.
Not tonight. She's okay. Good.
It was a beautiful afternoon and I hope you all got outside because I was at the park for the first time in almost 18 months.
Wow. Yeah, it was gorgeous today. Hi, Evlovskis.
Us. Hi, Sue, and presumably Steve.
Is that us or US? I'm not sure.
Us saying that they're
I'm
both
kidding,
there.
I know.
All right. It is.
You get the shout outs.
It's 9:01.
Yeah, so we've been we're actually going to start to move out of the heat of kind of what we've been talking about for the past little bit, which is the whole idea of conflict. And really the reason we've been talking about it is it's something we all face, but none of us really like it very much. And we don't spend any time on it unless we're in it. And so what that means is it's like trying to play a sport that you've never practiced for, or an instrument that you've never rehearsed, or to do something like that, and you're doing it for the first time. And so there actually is a set of skills around this. And one of the things I believe is that the people of God, actually the church, Christians, however you want to describe that, very often we are known for not doing conflict well at all. And the reason is because we come to faith, and instead of learning how to do conflict in a healthy way, in a life-giving way, in a restorative way, we actually just avoid it, or we brush it under the rug, or we spiritualize it. And so it actually makes it much worse over time. We've talked about some of the reasons for that. But what we've been trying to do is look at some ways that we can do this better. Because if you have relationships, if you have people, and they're in proximity to each other, they will at some point bump into each other, and there will be conflict. If you're married, you know that this is true. And if you have friends, if you have family, if you work with people, you know it's true. And tonight we're going to talk about something that is related to this, but it's actually the source of a lot of relational conflict. And what I mean by that is you get in conflict with people, like someone cuts you off at a light or something like that. You don't really know that person and you're upset at them, but you don't really have relationship with them. But the people you have relationships with, there's this source that we discover that is actually at the root of so much of relational conflict. And it's this idea. It's the idea that first of all, you're wired for relationships, meaning that you're not wired to go, even if you're like one of these super introvert people who just likes to be alone all the time and no one don't talk to me. You're actually wired. Human beings are wired to be in relationship. Different people have different capacities for that, but we're wired for it. But anytime there's relationships, whether you realize it or not, you have expectations about those relationships. And whether you realize it or not, you have expectations of each of the people in your relationships, whether they realize it or not. This is where this starts to get fun. And some of you, and we talked a lot about how our families of origin are actually a lot of the pattern for how we do conflict. Some of you grew up in a family and you observed your parents. And so when you got married, you basically, whether you know it or not, you subtly brought that template of what you saw in your parents' relationships into yours. And this happens everywhere: parents, siblings, bosses, coworkers, subordinates. And this is actually even true about God. And so the first place we're kind of stopping tonight is this big idea here. And by the way, welcome to At Nine. Talking about conflict, and we're also talking about expectations. I'm killing it with the banners tonight.
Yeah, right.
Here's the idea. Almost all of this sounds like a strong statement. Almost all of the conflict and disappointment we experience in our relationships comes from unfulfilled expectations we have of the other person. So almost all of the conflict and disappointment, I mean this in like relatively healthy relationships, not like super dysfunctional, or as I said, people you don't know that cut you off in traffic, that we have in our relationships come from things that we thought were going to happen, or we thought were true, or we thought whatever, and those things were not fulfilled. Derry and Andy, how does this idea strike you?
Oh, I would tend to agree with that 100%. Most of the conflicts that I see in relationships, where at least people have come and talked to me about, it's almost entirely, I could say over 90%, I don't know exactly, but over 90%, it's overwhelming that they go into this. The reason why there's a conflict is because there's an expectation on one side or both that's not being met.
Or they're not matching up
Yeah.
to what the other person believes.
This is what we have expectations of each other when we get into our when we get married, and when those things aren't met, then you have this huge it feels like this honeymoon period, and then it comes crashing straight down because those expectations aren't being met.
Well, here's, I mean, again, since we can talk from the trenches of being pastors, one of the things that I don't know if you've ever heard this in a relationship where people are dating, and maybe they're, especially if they're a little bit younger, it's very idyllic, and they're like, this other person completes me, and it sounds like a Hallmark movie or something, but it's this idea that there's something that this other person brings to me that makes me feel more complete,
Right?
Which, by the way, doesn't work, and always leads to disappointment.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, as time passes, that dynamic breaks down, because the person has an expectation. Hello, Lisa. Hello, Bruce.
Bruce and
Chris.
Karen,
And Chris. Get them all out.
Right? We have to catch up here a little bit. And so, I mean, obviously, we're using like those kind of relationships a lot, but it's really any kind of relationship.
Yeah.
But it's this idea that, there's these things that we expect of other people. And here's the catch. This is the thing that's really important. There was actually a study done about this. The majority of our expectations of others are not understood or even known by the other person.
Right.
And here's what that means. It means that there's some things that you expect of other people that you assume that they should understand that you expect of them. Or you say something like, well, anybody in their position would know that they're supposed to do this. And the truth is that they're not. And so what happens is when that kind of breaks down is there's conflict. Yeah. And there's disappointment, and it can go sideways really, really fast. Should we have no expectations? Hang on, Chris. You should have expectations, and you will, but there's a way that you have to have them. There's a way that they have to be
handling them handling them. It's really about handling them when they're not met.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and also figuring out, have I actually
said it all?
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you.
And so that's where we're going to land.
But yeah.
Sorry, we've got that sweet internet delay again tonight. It's because my son is screaming robots in the next room. Okay, so we have some Bible, because that's we are basing all things in Scripture, and we have a little story that some of you are familiar with in Luke chapter 10, verse 38 to 42. Derry or Andy, one of you want to read that for us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me.
Okay, so we're off to a great start. In this story, and some of you know the story. Jesus shows up, and really in that culture, really in any culture, ours included, when you have a guest over, especially a distinguished guest like Jesus would have been seen as a rabbi, everybody rolls out the red carpet. And so Martha opens her home. She's very stressed about it. She's making preparations. She has a sister who basically is just hanging out with Jesus, sitting at Jesus' feet. And so what does Martha do? Does Martha go to Mary and say, Mary, could you help me? No, she does not. So that's the first problem. She goes to Jesus, and it's interesting how this statement is phrased. Lord, don't you care? Have you ever had someone ask you something like that? And so here's where we start to see hidden expectations. We start to see them take root.
Yep.
Martha knows what she thinks Mary ought to be doing. Whether Mary knows that or not, we'll leave that for a second. But then Martha starts making assumptions about Jesus, that he's the one who doesn't care, even though she's the one who has put the pressure on herself.
Mm-hmm.
How many times have you or I or we or anyone listening, you've tried to pull someone in to your situation with you when you feel your emotions starting to spin out of control? What happens so often is we look for a wingman, kind of try to pull someone else in, and so that's, I mean, we have a word for that in Christianity. It's called gossip. But she starts to pull someone else in rather than addressing this. And so instead of going to Mary and saying, Mary, can you help? Or Mary, I thought you were going to help. Or Mary, anything about her expectations, she goes off to Jesus. And the expectation, here's what's crazy about it, though, is the expectations stay hidden. And so the passage goes on in verse 41. And that's your cue to read.
That's my cue to continue.
Yeah.
Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things.
So Jesus is basically identifying what Martha probably already knows is true a little bit. Mm-hmm. But it's this idea that when we have expectations about events, about circumstances, and about people, especially if they're hidden, we actually become enslaved by them. And so, if there's some expectation you have that's not being met of another person, of a relationship, of something like that, and you don't go surface it, you don't get it on the surface, it actually enslaves you. It actually holds power over you, and it becomes bondage. Verse 42.
But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her.
And so what Jesus is and this is where the short part of the story ends. Jesus is basically saying Mary has chosen not to make her expectations, not to make her any of the other things, but to make Jesus the center of her attention and focus. And as a result, she's at peace. And what's interesting is when you read the backstory of Mary in some of the surrounding literature and in the other Gospels, you discover she actually had all sorts of she had a pretty significant past, but she's chosen, even in spite of that, to lay that down and focus on Jesus. And so what happens very often, and this is something I've discovered about myself, maybe you've discovered it about you, is our expectations that we have of other people, especially the ones that we haven't communicated, are kind of wrapped up in our own stuff. Mm-hmm. They're wrapped up in our own issues. They're wrapped up in how we think things should go. They're wrapped up in all sorts of those things. But rather than spending a whole lot of time here, I want to kind of get back to what Chris was talking about. There's 4 truths about the vast majority of our unfulfilled expectations of other people. Mm-hmm. And one or more of them are true. And so what we're going to do kind of to wrap this all together is we're going to talk about, what happens with expectations that are unfulfilled or unmet, or these kind of things we've been talking about. And then what's a better version of that? What's a way to have what I'm calling great expectations? The first thing is this. A lot of times the expectations we have of other people are unconscious. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is simply this. It's an expectation we're not even aware of until someone disappoints us. Meaning there's something that you haven't sat down and had a meeting with yourself and said, okay, this is what I'm actually trying to do here. But there's this unconscious thing that you only discover it when someone else disappoints you. There's something that you thought they were going to be, or that you thought they were going to do, or you thought something like that. And then when you discover that, when you're disappointed in that, there's conflict. And this is like, it's interesting. Like, I've been married now 21 years. And my wife and I are both very strong personalities, and she'd tell you exactly the same thing. We're both type A, and the way that we've worked that out. I know, like, all the Pastor Andy, who's a great counselor, by the way, would probably say that one of the fruits of great marriage is compromise. We're not really good at compromise in the home, because what happens for strong personalities when they compromise is they feel like everyone feels like they've lost.
Lost,
Yes.
yeah.
And so what we do a lot of times is we basically just divvy up kind of responsibilities. Like, we redid our kitchen last year, and Grace is an amazing cook. She's a phenomenal cook. I'm very, very particular about colors and finishes and things like that. I'm the decorator. And so Grace, I sent her off with the cabinet guy and said, you go get whatever it is that you think you need and what you want. You get the layout you want. I get to pick all the fixtures and the colors. And it worked out great. Everyone's happy. But what we've discovered is when there's these things that we think the other person should do or is going to do, and we haven't really figured out what that is, those are the only times we really run into any kind of conflict. And it's just been interesting about that. So an unconscious expectation is something that you don't really know about until someone disappoints you. And one of the things you have to do, if you're listening to this, when you run into one of those, is you have to ask yourself, what does this tell me about me? Not what did the other person, what should they have done, or should they have known to do or whatever, but what am I learning about me that I expected that I wasn't even aware of? Has that ever happened to you guys?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I got so many examples of this. The first time I got a real job, expecting the boss who you first meet with them, and very different than the boss, 2 months down the road. Right. It's a very different person. So going into it, it's unconscious expectation. Oh, he's always this way. Not the case.
Yeah.
So yeah. And again, I didn't realize that was an expectation until I was let down.
Yeah. And then and then you kind of have to choose in that moment to do something with that.
Right.
So what happens with an unconscious expectation that you never deal with, either with the other person or with yourself, is it becomes bitterness.
Right.
Over time. It actually is conflict that's unresolved. And we talked about the fact that unresolved conflict leads to bitterness. And so that's the first one. The second one is probably a little more relatable.
Yeah.
And that is that many unfulfilled expectations of other people are unrealistic. We have illusions about what others should be. It's stuff like this. It's like when you have a friend and you expect that they're always going to be available. That's a realistic, healthy expectation. It's things like you have an expectation that your significant other, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your husband, your wife will fill the sense of longing and need within you. It's like I cringe whenever I hear someone say, she completes me or he completes me. Hello, Denise. And to make sure we get everyone here.
Yeah.
And like you were starting to say, Andy, it's a job, or a boss or someone like that that's going to strengthen your sense of identity or your strength. I went into my first several jobs with unrealistic expectations of the people who were in authority over me, that they were going to be perfect, that they were always going to know the answer, that they were, and that's just not realistic. So that's an unrealistic thing. One of the things that happens a lot, and this happens with people who have had bad experiences in their lives. They've had, weak parents, or they've had parents who, just were not what they should have been, or they went through a terrible relationship, is they kind of then bounced from that to the other side of saying, I am now shopping for the person who's never going to let me down, who's never going to disappoint me. you know, we do that with role models. We do that with parents and pastors and churches, you know, that they'll always perform perfectly and they'll
Mhm.
never disappoint. That is an unrealistic expectation. Why is it
Yeah.
unrealistic? Because nobody can do that.
No.
And there's actually, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. There's actually a cycle that can happen sometimes where, oh, hi, Kate. There's a cycle that happens sometimes where we start out with unrealistic expectations and we know kind of subconsciously they're going to be disappointed, but
Mhm.
when they are, it allows us to kind of have a grievance.
Hmm.
Allows us to say, you know, well, they always do that, or people always let me down, and it sounds like so sad and unfortunate, but it's just people are imperfect.
Mhm.
I'm not talking about toxic people. I'm talking about people.
Yeah.
Yes, it is totally possible to have unrealistic expectations of yourself. You know, whenever, and this again, there's a lot of times this, uh, Denise, where unrealistic expectations come from is past trauma,
Mhm.
which is the idea of I will never let that happen again. I will always, I will never, they will always, they will never. A lot of times there's something that's happened back there that's really kind of created this polarization. And it's just not possible to do that. So an unrealistic expectation is going to go unfulfilled. Um, Here's a good one: unspoken. Um, and this kind of gets back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. Should we have expectations? Yes, you
Mhm.
can. But if you never communicate them directly, you don't really have the ability to get angry when they're not met.
Right.
You know, and every time I talk about this with people, they're always like, "Well, he or she should know." Well, no, don't give anyone that much credit. It's like if you have an expectation,
Mm.
um,
Rick had a good answer right here. We had some people come to the mission field to work with us. It was rough, but we continued to ask what their expectations were. And they said they had no expectations, but obviously they did. But we never met those expectations. And that makes for a very hard week of work.
yeah,
You can't say you have no expect. Everyone has
yeah. Let's
expectations.
talk
Yes.
about that. That is literally impossible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Literally impossible to have no expectations.
Yes. That is very
Yeah.
true.
And
Somewhere along the lines, you have the expectation in your mind.
yeah,
Doesn't
yeah,
mean you sat down and wrote them out, but it is in your brain.
yeah. If you're saying I have no expectations, what you're saying is I really have a bunch of unconscious expectations, but I haven't
Right.
figured out what they are yet.
Either that or your opinion of
They
that
were
person
on
or the
staff. Well, that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, and Bruce, this is a great. Uh, See, now you're chiming in, and it's going to get real in here. This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, parenting. Some of you, you've been parents. Some of you, you're relatively new. Like, you know, we have young kids. You have expectations of your children, whether you know it or not.
Yes.
And one of the things that's really important, like you say, Bruce, is that they have to be appropriate.
Yeah.
Um, they are unique. Like each child is unique. So like child A, you can't take the expectations that you had for them and stick them on the other one. You can't take the expectations that were placed on you and place it on your kids. Um, but you actually have to surface them and really you have to like get it out there. What is this thing that I'm actually expecting?
Yeah.
And
And get it
communicate
out
to them.
Yeah. Got it.
And if they're old, and even if at a young level, you have to communicate it to them too. I mean, they could be 2 years old, and you don't expect them to just throw their stuff and not go pick it up. I mean, you go walk with them and do the thing, but you still talk to them about it. You don't just expect them. Oh, okay, I'm not going to say anything, but I expect him to go pick it up and put his clothes away.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing that's actually beginning to communicate it even at a very, very basic level.
Yes.
But it's so important. It's so important to identify your own expectations
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and talk. I mean, one of the best ways to do this is to really talk this out with somebody. Again, trusted friend. It can be someone who knows you. It can be a professional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Through this stuff. I really think, especially if you've had trauma in your past, working this stuff out with a professional, a counselor, is a really, really good idea because you're not going to be able to make healthy sense of that on your own. But it's figuring out what are the things I actually expect. What are the things I expect of my husband or my wife, or what are the things I expect of this next season of my life. One of the things I think that's great is when you change. Rick, you're talking about when people come onto the mission field who are going to work there. Obviously, that's a huge change of life for most people.
Mhm.
But it's when you are going around the corner of a change in your life is to really start as much as you can to say, what am I expecting to happen here? And then at least you have the ability to engage with it because it's like it's out. It's in the
Mhm.
Right.
surface. It's not like this hidden kind of squishy thing that you can't really make any sense of. But that's one of the big ones is unspoken expectations. And here's the last one. And some of you might disagree with this, but I have the slides. So no, it's unagreed on expectations. You can't place someone else. And I know if you have a 2-year-old, it's a little hard to get them to agree on an expectation, but it's like Daria, you were saying really well. You have to kind of show them what that expectation looks like and make sure it's reasonable. But you may have your own thoughts about what was expected, but if the other person hasn't actually agreed to that, you don't have an agreed on expectation.
Right.
And you don't have a valid expectation at that point. Valid expectations are always something that's mutually agreed on.
Mhm.
Rick
Yeah,
doesn't agree.
doesn't agree. Of course. Yeah, I actually have the ability to kick people off the chat too, I think. But it's figuring that out. And one of the things at leaders, and I'm not speaking specifically to Rick's situation, but if you're a leader, one of the best things you can do is create. You can kind of help surface these things and kind of lead in communicating what people can expect who don't think they expect things.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love you too, by the way. And,
Yeah.
and Rick and I, actually, I think all of us have a wonderful relationship with them. But we're sending a team down there, so you'll get to see if some people have some expectations. But really, it's this. It's if you expect your husband to do X, Y, or Z, or you expect your wife to do X, Y, or Z, or you expect your subordinate, your employee, or your kids, or whatever, at some point you have to actually communicate that, and you have to arrive at a point where you both agree on what the expectation is, and this actually can take some negotiation.
Mhm.
But think about the flip side of that. Like, we hate when other people do this to us.
Yeah.
Like when someone has an expectation to you that you didn't know that they had of you, and you find out because they're upset or because they won't talk to you or because of whatever. We hate how that feels. And so one of the most important things to do is to communicate and agree on it. And yes, Chris, exactly. You have to communicate. First of all, you have to know what it is that you're asking. You have to get clear on that, but then you have to communicate it. And you have to say, here's this thing. We're in a relationship together. Any relationship is a two-way street, or at least it should be. What are some things we can expect of each other? Andy, I'm sure you do this with people who are going to get married. So do I. But it's just as much as possible trying to get as much of that on the surface early.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Just try to talk that out. Like, okay, what did your parents do that you're subtly expecting that this person's going to do that they may not even know about?
Right.
Yeah, Terry says communicate and don't assume. Do not assume. Do not assume. And sometimes it's like, well, they should know that. Well, as I said, maybe they don't know that.
Mhm.
Just assume they don't know that and say,
Or it's not agreed upon.
yeah.
Yes, or not what you're thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the things where those are the ways that unfulfilled expectations work themselves out, and unfulfilled expectations always lead to conflict. Always lead to conflict. So because we're trying to give the other side of this too. These are what great expectations. Let's see what I did there with that title. These are what great expectations look like. They're kind of the opposite of all those things. And the first one is this: conscious. I have to become aware of the expectations I have for the other person in a coherent manner. meaning I have to know what it is that I have decided that I expect of this person. And I have to be able to articulate it. Like I have to be able to say it in a way that people understand. And the first thing I think when we push back on that, we say, well, no, I shouldn't have to. Yes, you have to do that. That's the first thing you have to do. The second is this: realistic. Is what I expect a reasonable thing to expect? You know, you'll be home from work at 6 p.m. for dinner and you'll help me with the kids, you know, put them to bed. That's a reasonable thing. You know, there's lots of unreasonable ways that can work, but that's the realistic thing is communicate it. I have to speak my expectations clearly, directly, and respectfully to the person in a way that they understand. So conscious, realistic, and communicated. Yeah, actually, Karen, this is perfect. Communication is one of those things that I think we automatically assume we can all do, but it's just like conflict. Unless you practice it, it doesn't happen automatically, or at least there's a lot of crossed wires in the process of that. Yeah, I think Denise, this is a tricky one because I think a lot of these things around expectations you do need to process and you need to talk through them. Yeah, expectations, even if you're not a verbal processor, I'm totally a verbal processor. You've probably figured that out by now. But it's how do I work this out with someone in a way that doesn't end up being gossipy? But it is figuring out how someone who is for us, for the relationship, how can I process some of these things out with them? So communicated, and the last one is what we're calling validated or agreed upon. And so what that is in order for my expectations to be valid, the person must be aware of, and they must agree to them. Otherwise, it's simply a hope. And this always ends up being something that you do have to kind of work out and negotiate with the other person. Any thoughts on this, Andy and Daria?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is number one, you knowing yourself before bringing it forth to anyone. There's no point in being in conflict or bringing something to someone if the expectation is really yourself and it's not something that's even attainable or sustainable by the others. And I thought that things were like in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, you know, like this is an expectation. Why is no one else understanding this? And it really wasn't. And it was because somebody else didn't communicate to those people as well. So it's not just always about you and the other person. There could be a bigger picture where it's just not all about you. And that's another area where you could just pull back and then a moment and then know if, did somebody just fall? Oh no. And then just know if it's something worth stepping into. Jobs. I think job descriptions are huge. Sometimes we're in jobs and we're like, well, the expectations there, but I've never heard that before. That's very common. I'm not even just talking about ministry. I've been in other jobs where it's like, oh, I needed you to do this. Well, I had no idea that was my responsibility or on my plate. That's very hard. And then it leaves disappointment on both sides because one person doesn't want to let the other person down. And then the other person's frustrated that you didn't do what they wanted you to do. So a lot can be avoided if the communication happens early on and continues because the expectations change. They're not just like, here's the expectations and move on. In every scenario, in every situation, there's growth and change and transition. So you have to continually go back and communicate.
Yeah, even the things that we think are common sense.
Yeah.
I remember back before Daria and I met, I was seeing a girl in college, and I just told her, I was like, look, you know, if at any point you want to call this quits, just let me know. Let me know. We'll talk about it. We'll be chill with it, but just don't cheat on me. That's all I ask. Like, that's common sense. I shouldn't have to state that, but it happened. She big fat did it anyway. You know what I mean? It's just like, so even if you think it makes sense, even if you think it's the right thing, and it should just be something understood. You have these, even if they're low expectations going into it, making sure they're clearly stated. No, even then they might not be agreed upon. Knowing what you're getting into before you get into it, that goes a long way, a really long way. And when I talk to couples, it's the same exact thing. I have them go home. That's one of their home assignments. You go home, you write a list of expectations. I mean, a list, 18 pages, front and back, a list of what your expectations are for your partner. What do you expect this to go? And then, you talk about them. And then if you have some issues, bring them back.
Right.
And we can talk about them. And they get a laugh out of it, because what one thought was an expectation for the other person, they had no idea. And so when they come back together and start talking about it, and what a difference it makes right off the bat.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you were saying, both of you, around that is sometimes putting those expectations out there, even if they seem very simple and kind of like elementary, is it actually sets the other person free.
Yeah,
because they have all sorts of things they're projecting about what they think you expect, and you have all the things that you think they should know that you expect, and just actually like putting some concrete truth or fact into the space in the middle of that releases all of those, that whole wondering, woulda, coulda, shoulda kind of thing. And I think the other thing you said, yes, is that this is an ongoing moving target, in a way that as your relationship grows, your expectations change, your understanding of each other changes, and so it's something that needs to be revisited. So I had a couple kind of, how do we land this plane, and what do we do with this? Next steps as we kind of close it up tonight. And the first one is kind of related to some of what you just said. Where in your life do you have anger or disappointment in a relationship over a set of expectations that you can release another person from and set them and you free? Here's what I mean by that. I mean that you have a set of expectations that you've had that you've now realized that are unconscious, they're unrealistic, they're unspoken, or they're unagreed upon. Meaning there's something you expected that other person to do or be, or a hole that they were supposed to fill, or a role that they were supposed to fill, and you never told them, or you weren't even really aware of it until now. One of the choices you have in that moment is you can actually release that person from those things, because you realize it's not really a valid thing to expect. It's something that you weren't even aware of, or something that honestly is probably unrealistic. It's idealistic, or never communicated, or they've never said, "Hey, I can do this. Let's do this together." And so, one of the things you can do in that moment is you can release that person. And what happens is, you not only release them, you release yourself. Unmet expectations, like we said in the beginning, they're just this fountain of disappointment. They actually bind us. They put us in bondage. And so maybe that's you tonight. Maybe there's a spot where, and it can be very small, or it can be much larger than that. But it's like, hey, I just realized I had this expectation, and it's not. It's something that I can let go now that I'm aware that it's not really a valid thing to expect. It's either it's any one of those four things: unconscious, unrealistic, unspoken, unagreed upon. And the second thing is kind of the other side of that. How can you clarify an expectation in a specific relationship in your life in a way that will bring peace to it? And maybe it's saying, okay, I've become aware of this thing that I expect that I'm not sure the other person knew about, or that we agreed upon. I can now go to that person and say, hey, I've really been struggling with this. And as I've kind of worked it out, I've discovered there's this thing that is really important to me about our relationship. And I want to talk about it and see if it's something we can get together on. And probably they'll have some of you as well, some expectations of you. But that's the starting point for a conversation that builds communication, like Karen was saying earlier, and it builds trust. And relationships with more trust are better relationships. So that's what it means. That's what it means to have good expectations. Any last words, Andy and Daria?
Just honesty and vulnerability go a long way.
Mm-hmm.
If you're willing to admit that, maybe these were unrealistic expectations, and claim it as your own fault for feeling like you've been let down. Starting there, it takes the pressure off the other person, like they did something wrong when it was really your expectation to begin with. Yeah.
And sometimes you need to apologize for that too, because it's not their fault and they didn't know it. So when you put the unrealistic expectation on someone, it does cause a rift or a feeling in between the relationship, and you might not see it, but the other person might feel it. It's definitely there. And it just causes an unnecessary tension. So sometimes it's just going to the person and apologizing and saying, listen, I had this unrealistic expectation that I've been holding over you, and I need to release you, myself, all of us from it. Sometimes we forget to do that because there is an apology aspect to it if we are wrong, or if we're not even handling it the right way.
Yeah, that's another great way to open a conversation and kind of deflate some of the tension that's around this. Just say, hey, there's this thing I realized that I thought you were supposed to be or do that is not really something you should have to be or do, and I'm sorry for having. I'm sorry for the the stress that's inflicted on our relationship for having done that. Yeah, it's really, really good. As always, to a close. Couple things. First of all, we have an online Connect card. You know that. Most of you who are regulars here, we'd love for you to use it. If there's any way we can help you with any of this stuff, any next steps, obviously reach out to us in the comments. But we'd love for you to do that. And I want to open this up a little bit more as well. If there's something you would love for us to talk about or tackle here on At Night, we would love some thoughts about that. Something that might help you if we unpacked it for some time, and we'd love to make this something that really benefits all of us as much as possible. And this is, I think, a very rich time that I've really come to appreciate. And I appreciate all of your trust and your vulnerability and things. And really, this is, how do we live this life that Jesus has given us that says, if we're walking in Jesus, we will not only have a life, we'll have it to the full. And how do we do that? That's really what our time together is. And so any way we can do that, we'd love to tackle some stuff that maybe is pertinent to you where you are, and you can just throw that in the Connect card, and we'd love to maybe consider doing that. So, Daria, would you pray for us?
Sure. Oops, sorry. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for just another night where we can be transparent and vulnerable and talk about things that will help us with other relationships, with coworkers, with spouses, with children, to just be a better friend, Father. And we just thank you for opening our eyes to different ways that we might not have looked at the expectations and how that, affects conflict with other people. I pray right now, even as we end here tonight, that we would think about if there are things that are getting in the way by having expectations either on ourselves or with other people that is causing a divide or tension or something that doesn't feel right. Because oftentimes when it doesn't feel right, there means there's something more there. So I pray that we go after it individually. I pray that you give us boldness to approach someone if we need to make that right. And Father, I pray that everybody here would be comfortable sitting with you and asking you if there are things that we need to change when it comes to expectations for ourselves, for the things that we're doing with work, as a family member, as a person in our community, as a neighbor. There's so many different aspects where expectations and communication is key. And so we just ask that you reveal it to us, that you speak to our hearts. And I just pray that you be with us for the rest of this evening and bring us back together next Tuesday night. And it's in your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks for hanging out and being here. And we'll hang out in the comments section. And hopefully we will see you next week. Have a good night.
Bye.